Sötkin så när jag har jag tjäsen så och massione. Dat is een gekke luid sötkin. Da han så heißen da kan ni die goyachi got hayake hundale sen hayak tjäne. Yatharechi yadanizichi visit out here haunted got hayak a honda colonies the guards at any day I one day. Yakin take week at the niggas in the take windy. What I thought that the daddy and going the dog on not taking against all taking lonely. What's in the water on that is not here haunted in there. Yatharechi yadanizichi visit out here haunted the son of Chimasi.
Please be seated. Good afternoon, colleagues.
Zatanik Ehunsi.
Jonas Lafferty for his opening blessing. Please join me in thanking them both for a wonderful start to the city. I'm also pleased to welcome our pages to the Chamber. Our youth are our future, and we are fortunate to have them with us. This week, we will have pages from Yellowknife, and next week we'll also be joined by pages from Hay River and Fort Providence. I thank each of them for joining us here and hope they have a great time and the opportunity to learn from our unique form of consensus government. For the pages who will be joining us during this city and all youth across the territories, I'd like to take a moment to remind you about our upcoming Youth Parliament. This program is open to grade 9 and 10 students and is on application based. Applications are due on February 14th. If you would like to apply or just want some more information, please visit our website at www.ntassembly.ca. That's www.ntassembly.ca. Colleagues, February is Indigenous Language Month, and I look forward to hearing our languages spoken each day. When we use our language in this House and when we have our proceedings interpreted, we are helping to promote and revitalize our language. This is one very important way we can and do show our respect for the language and culture of our people. I'm deeply proud of the work we do to use and grow our language. The hard work and dedication of our interpreters bring our words to life and bring our messages to residents in their language. We couldn't do it without the interpreters, and we are honored to work with such a dedicated team. Colleagues, please remember to speak slowly, clearly for our interpreters and everyone who's watching our proceedings. Please join me in thanking our interpreters and welcome them back to this assembly. Before I continue, I am saddened to advise the passing of two of our interpreters since we last sat in this House. Tom Anka of Fort Res passed away in December of 2024, and Miss Evelyn Perry of Fort McPherson passed away in January of this year. Mr. Anka was known for his dedication to the interpretation of the Dene Sulni and made it possible for constituents near and far to tune in and understand the Assembly's proceedings in their own language. Ms. Perry was a great advocate for her language. Her contribution to preserving the Gwich'in language is celebrated with her strong commitment to provide excellence in her professional interpretation career. Both Mr. Anka and Ms. Perry have been instrumental in the preservation and revitalization of their language. Their passing are one of the great losses to this institution, the people of the Northwest Territories, and to friends and family. Colleagues, in recognition of their service to this Assembly and to their language culture, please join me in a moment of silence to honor Mr. Anka and Ms. Perry. Thank you. Colleagues, I've said this before, but I'll repeat myself here. When I was selected as your speaker, I called for thoughtful, meaningful, and honest debate. I still expect that from each of you. Do the people we represent in this chamber. We all have different perspectives and have had different experiences bring us to where we are today. We cannot and will not always see eye to eye, and we don't have to. That's not why we are here. It's okay for us to disagree with each other, but when we do, we must strive to do so without being disagreeable and disrespectful. When we do not see eye to eye, we must choose our words carefully to show our dignity, our humility, and our respect for each other, this institution, and our residents. We are fortunate to govern and work in this environment, and it is our responsibilities as members of this Legislative Assembly to uphold the highest standards that are expected by our residents and is both deserved and required by this institution. Consensus government isn't about agreeing all the time. It is about having your say and your opportunity to share how we govern and care for our residents. It's about doing our best to represent the people who have elected us, representing ourselves and our personal beliefs and convictions. Consensus government is, I believe, about respect. When you speak in this chambers, you're speaking on behalf of your constituents, and you are speaking to me as your speaker. I will insist on this. I will insist that you deliver your words and carry yourself with respect and in keeping with our rules. If you are in the chambers and do not have the floor to speak, I expect you to listen to our colleagues and not to create a distraction for each other who are speaking and listening to each other. Colleagues, be respectful of all members of the Legislative Assembly, both with your words and how you use your time. Please avoid lengthy preambles to your statements, questions, and answers. Please refrain from making unnecessary noises or disruptions when somebody else is speaking. Even if you are not listening, others are, and they deserve that opportunity. As your speaker, our rules provide me with the tools to ensure that our proceedings take place with a level of respect and decorum that is expected of us. I would prefer not to rely on my authority to ensure this is a respectful workplace, which is why I reminded you today of my expectations. But please understand that I am both able and willing to do what it is if it's required. Colleagues, our behavior in this House is governed by our rules. If we haven't done so recently, I strongly encourage each of you to review them again. If you have questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to speak to me or to one of our table officers. We're here to help and to ensure that our proceedings are effective, efficient, and in keeping with our rules. I've received the following correspondence to the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, the Honourable Gerald W. Kassoon. It states, "Dear Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise that I recommend to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, the passage of the Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2025-2026, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operational Expenditures number 2, 24-25, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Infrastructure Expenditure number 3, 2024-2025. And during the Assembly and March sitting of the First Assembly of the 20th Legislative Assembly. Yours truly, Gerald W. Kassoon. Before we continue to the orders of the day, I'd like to advise members that I've prepared to provide my ruling on the point of privilege that was raised by the member of Yellowknife Centre on November 1st, 2024, the last day we sat together in this chamber. On November 1st, 2024, the member from Yellowknife Centre rose on a point of privilege. He cited an exchange where the member from Yellowknife North referred to the member from Yellowknife Centre's action as petty. This occurred outside the chamber. The member was correct in raising the point of privilege and not a point of order. The rules of the Legislative Assemblies applies to the proceedings, whether in the chamber or in the committee. The privilege of the Assembly and the members apply more broadly. Members must be free from obstruction and intimidation. This privilege safeguards their ability to do their job without fear of undue pressure or influence. The point of privilege raised by the member from Yellowknife Centre is that the use of the term petty to describe his actions was an obstruction or an act of intimidation. When a point of privilege is raised, two things must be decided. The first is whether the point of privilege was raised at the earliest opportunity. The second is whether, on the face of it, there is an issue of privilege to be determined. This is often referred to whether there is a prima facie case of privilege. In this case, the member from Yellowknife Centre raised the issue within a short enough time period to meet the first part of the test. However, based on my review, as past decisions in this House, I'm not convinced there is an issue of privilege to be determined. There is no prima facie case of privilege. There's no evidence that the use of the word petty obstructed the member's ability to fulfill his duties. There was no evidence that the comment was part of a broader pattern of intimidation. In February 2010, the Speaker of the time was faced with a similar point of privilege. The member from the Mackenzie Delta rose on a point of privilege that when leaving the chambers, he was called a name by the member from Nuvik Twin Lakes and followed into the bathroom. The Speaker ruled that while name-calling was inappropriate, it did not rise to the level of a breach of privilege. The Speaker noted that a comment may be disrespectful, even inappropriate, but if it's not material affected by members' ability to do their job, it is not a matter of privilege. I agree. In this case, while the use of the word petty was inappropriate and should not have been said, it was not a matter of privilege. Members, you're passionate advocates for strong beliefs, and you should not be here, you would not be here otherwise. But you must set an example by always being respectful and professionals. Minister's statements. Where's my list? Sorry. Minister statements. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise the House I intend to deliver the budget address on Thursday, February 6, 2025. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance. Minister statements. Mr. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise the House that the Honourable Member for Cam Lake, Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, will be absent from the House today and tomorrow to attend the Arctic 360 Conference in Toronto, Ontario. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Minister statements. Mr. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, a year ago I delivered the first sessional statement of the 20th Legislative Assembly. We had not yet established our collective priorities, but we had begun to establish the relationship essential to the work of consensus government, which continues to shape our efforts today. When I presented my candidacy for Premier, I spoke to a vision of a thriving and prosperous NWT 50 years in the future, built through partnership and collaborative governance with Indigenous governments. This is the foundation of my hope and of the optimism and positivity I strive to bring to the office of the Premier. We are in times of great global uncertainty, but I remain resolute and absolutely certain of the promise, potential, and bright future of our land and people. Mr. Speaker, these are uncertain times, nationally and internationally, marked by challenges that not only define our present, but also shape our future that we are working to build. Yet these challenges are also opportunities for Canada and the NWT to build a stronger, more diverse economy centered on the rights and priorities of Indigenous peoples. We in the North are at the front line of asserting Canada's sovereignty through our presence and use of the land. Any plan for the Arctic must be reflective of Northerners' priorities and perspectives. This renewed national focus, reinforced by the release of Canada's Arctic foreign policy and updated defence strategy, demonstrates an appreciation for the nation-building work needed in Canada's Arctic. Mr. Speaker, the work of government continues despite the challenges before us. It is guided by the mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories, which was developed and tabled early last year based on the priorities of this 20th Legislative Assembly. The mandate sets out the priorities and commitments for the GNWT, and these are reflected in the business plans and budgets for the upcoming fiscal year. One of the priorities we collectively set was addressing the effects of trauma. I believe this to be at the heart of the work that we must do. Individual, collective, and intergenerational trauma from colonialism and racism are behind many of the health and social challenges affecting our families and communities. The GNWT is taking steps to support healing through equitable, person-centered, anti-racist, and trauma-informed care and services. This includes the Men's Healing Fund, which supports community-led men's healing programming as a preventative approach to address family, intimate partner, and gender-based violence. 7 communities received full proposal-based funding in 24-25 to support activities including on the land, healing, trauma and addictions programming, narrative therapy intervention strategies, and intensive healing programs. Through flexible bilateral agreements with the Government of Canada, the $16 million 10-year National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence provided each jurisdiction with the choice to allocate funding for their respective priorities, needs, and challenges. In the NWT, more than 80% of this funding flowed directly to NWT communities. The first annual report was released in the fall of 2024. Mr. Speaker, homelessness is a complex issue, and the GNWT's homelessness strategy takes a holistic, interdepartmental approach to address homelessness. In late fall of 2024, the GNWT implemented an on-the-land camp as a temporary intervention and critical step in the GNWT's broader strategy. The closure of the camp in mid-January marks a shift towards more permanent solutions, including the development of additional transitional and supportive housing options. The GNWT and its partners continue to address mental wellness and addictions recovery through programming in every community. A milestone over the past year was the completion of all 24 action items in the Addictions Prevention and Recovery Services Work Plan. In the coming months, results from this work will include the launch of 2 transitional housing programs in Yellowknife and Inuvik, made possible through federal funding and local partnerships. Mr. Speaker, we all want safe communities for Northerners. With the NWT having some of the highest crime and victimization rates in Canada, it is critical that we understand and address the root causes of crime. The GNWT is committed to improving the safety and well-being of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people, and has developed missing persons legislation that will address some of the barriers that make it difficult to investigate missing persons cases and create greater certainty about what information police can request in these situations. Another tangible initiative in the NWT is the implementation of body-worn cameras for frontline RCMP officers across the territory. Body-worn cameras provide an objective view of police interactions, improve evidence gathering, and enhance resolution to public complaints. These cameras have been a national standard for RCMP frontline policing since 2020, and implementation in the NWT began last year, with full implementation expected in 6 to 8 months. Mr. Speaker, our government is supporting healthy people and communities. It is essential that we take an integrated approach to healthcare as we provide culturally respectful, trauma-informed, and recovery-oriented services within the health and social services system. The GNWT is focusing on increasing access to healthcare and addressing systemic inequities and inefficiencies. The Healthcare System Sustainability Unit was created to ensure the NWT's health and social services system is fiscally sustainable and efficient. This federally funded unit will focus on understanding which health and social services are essential for the NWT while maintaining quality and access to these services for residents. Beyond this important foundational work, our government has prioritized operational oversight and transformation required for health and social services authorities to deliver services in a way that are sustainable and flexible and adaptable to community needs and outside pressures. The appointment of a public administrator with experience in leading health system transformation is an investment in the future. Mr. Speaker, healthy people and communities is about much more than just health services. Climate change is a reality in the NWT, and there are many initiatives underway to help prepare, prevent, and mitigate damage and health issues from natural disasters. This includes a network of air quality monitors across 26 communities to help inform public health decisions during wildfire events. With investments in the NWT energy strategy, we are on track to meet our 2030 emissions reduction goals. Engagement on the draft Climate Change Action Plan is complete and will inform and support implementation of the 2030 NWT Climate Change Strategic Framework, positioning the NWT to better adapt to climate challenges while pursuing clean energy opportunities and green jobs for Northerners. The GNWT is working with the organizations Sport Law and Alias to provide an independent reporting mechanism for instances of maltreatment in sport. This function will collect complaints and concerns from employees and other stakeholders, informing a suite of safe sport policies. Territorial and sports organizations will be required to have safe sport policies and plans in place to receive program funding and ensure that each organization is safe, welcoming, inclusive, and free from discrimination and harassment. Mr. Speaker, strong and stable economies and employment opportunities are important for community wellness and vibrancy. To strengthen the economic foundations of the NWT, the GNWT will support the development of private sector and community capacity, encourage a diversity of economic activity across sectors, and reduce the cost of doing business in the NWT. Partnerships make us all stronger, and the work we do with Indigenous governments is critical to building healthy and strong economies through projects around the Northwest Territories. Over the past year, we have worked with Indigenous governments to make progress in expanding Indigenous-led conservation through funding agreements that will support Northern conservation. I'm proud of the work we've done together to advance negotiations and legislation to establish the NWT Our Land for the Future Agreement, which provides $375 million to support Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship and creates employment opportunities in small communities. The GNWT is committed to advancing economic reconciliation through improved inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the workforce, supporting Indigenous entrepreneurship, and integrating Indigenous businesses into the procurement process. One of the ways we are doing this is by preparing a public engagement on the new Indigenous procurement policy, which would include a preference for NWT Indigenous businesses. The results of the engagement will be shared publicly and will ensure fair and transparent processes while respecting treaty obligations and trade agreements. Mr. Speaker, we're also supporting traditional livelihoods through a range of programs. Hunters and trappers have always been important to NWT communities, and through the Community Harvesters Assistance Program, we continue to provide direct support to help sustain and strengthen traditional practices. The Genuine Mackenzie Valley Fur Program helped NWT trappers sell more than 19,000 pelts worth approximately $520,000 last season. Additionally, 93 individuals completed their hunter education program, 136 residents across the territory attended trapper training in 2023 and 2024, and 15 trapping mentorship pairs were supported. Investing in these programs supports the traditional knowledge of hunters and trappers, protects natural resources for future generations, and improves the economic prospects for those who dedicate their lives to this vital work. Mr. Speaker, we have also achieved significant milestones and results in our strategic infrastructure priorities. Last summer, my home community of Hay River celebrated the completion of 2 major projects that will provide immediate support to the community and long-term investment for the territory. The opening of Hay River's fish processing plant will allow us to support the growth of the commercial fishing industry by processing up to 1.5 million pounds of fish annually, and will help to reinvigorate the fishing sector. The Hay River Harbor was also fully dredged, reopening a navigable emergency channel and a critical link in the territory's transportation network. Important milestones were achieved in the development of the Mackenzie Valley Highway and the Inuvik Airport. The Mackenzie Valley Highway is currently undergoing environmental assessment and community engagement. Pending a successful assessment, we will begin regulatory authorizations, obtain project funding, advance procurement, and secure land tenure requirements. The GNWT also completed lengthening the existing Inuvik Airport runway by 1,500 feet and widening of the runway safety area. At a time when the national and global focus is on the north, it is important that the Government of Canada continue to invest in the NWT's infrastructure. We also signed 2 significant agreements this year that will create opportunities for Northerners. The first is a Memorandum of Understanding for collaboration on the advancement of economic corridors with the Government of Alberta. This MOU will help attract new jobs, drive infrastructure development, and leverage the strengths of both Alberta and the NWT. The second is the Canada Community Building Fund Renewal Agreement, which will provide approximately $94.5 million for community government capital projects over the next 5 years. Mr. Speaker, one consideration as we advance new capital projects in strategic infrastructure is how they can help mitigate and respond to climate-driven events such as floods and fires. Following the unprecedented 2023 wildfire season, the GNWT has taken important steps to enhance our wildfire management program to best protect NWT residents and communities. An external review of the 2023 response provided 25 recommendations to improve mitigation, preparedness, and response efforts. While full implementation will take time, the GNWT is acting on these recommendations to strengthen wildlife prevention and emergency management across the territory. We updated the NWT Emergency Plan in 2024 to clarify roles and responsibilities of community governments as the lead for emergency management, including the need for hosting and evacuation plans and clarity around reimbursable expenses. The response to the 2024 wildfires in Fort Liard and Fort Good Hope were a first step in testing the investments made and the collaborative efforts from communities, Indigenous governments, and local leadership. Mr. Speaker, to effectively address the territory's housing crisis and improve the suitability, accessibility, and affordability of housing options in the NWT, we must work collaboratively with Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations, Canada, communities, and partners and stakeholders to deliver more homes for Northerners. Housing NWT is actively advancing major projects in Yellowknife, such as Aspen Apartments, a 36-unit building being modernized through multi-level government partnership focused on key building components, including a new biomass heat plant, which is expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and operating costs. In the coming months, additional housing units will be ready for move-in across the territory in the Mackenzie Delta, Montfouille, Nahende, the Nakput, Satu, and Tuneta-Willowday ridings, creating new housing options and more homes for Northerners. 5 new seniors duplexes are under construction in Fort McPherson, Toledo, Fort Simpson, Fort Resolution, and Betchico, and will include accessible kitchens, washrooms, and entryways, and spaces for traditional food preparation. Initiatives like these enable seniors to age in place in their communities, keeping families together. We have also signed agreements with the Tlicho government, Satu Secretariat Incorporated, Delaney Gotenay government, and most recently the Gwich'in Tribal Council to address housing needs through cooperation and respect. Homelessness is about more than just housing. The causes are complex, and our approach to addressing it must be multifaceted. Over the past year, our government has taken steps to tackle homelessness using community-led solutions. In October 2024, the GNWT committed $445,000 annually to the Métis Local 51 to support the operations of the Hay River Homeless Shelter. To help strengthen shelter operations, we provided specialized training for staff, focusing on safety, mental health support, and case management. While we are making progress in building and expanding the availability of housing, we are keenly aware that the need outweighs our ability to provide, so we continue to leverage our partnerships and possibilities. Mr. Speaker, this is only a snapshot of the good work currently underway. There are many actions in planning and early implementation, and more to come. Our mandate commitments span the full 4-year term of this government. In the first year, we have taken decisive steps to lay the foundations and build relationships with partners and leaders that will help us as we move forward together. The world is changing rapidly, and the North is not immune to global challenges. But by working together, we can turn these challenges into opportunities and make the NWT a place where people want to live, work, and raise their families for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member from Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to ask the Premier to give residents hope in a tangible way. In his territorial address yesterday, one thing he said caught my ear. We must be bold when the moment demands it. While I'm happy that we're standing strong with Team Canada, that Canadians have come together to support each other and are committed to buying local and buying Canadian, I'm still concerned. There's so much at stake. I'm watching a U.S. administration strip away protections, supports, and educational materials needed by gender-diverse Americans, low-income Americans, and tear apart funding for legislated responsibilities to provide international aid. I am watching a U.S. administration say that they will take over Gaza from the Palestinian people. These actions are creating fear and anxiety for many folks. Specifically, I want to say to the trans and non-binary people in our community and in my life that I love and support you. Shock and awe is being directed against American citizens, so much so that social media is awash with coded ways to resist. Once again, uncertainty is gripping our world. This time it isn't a pandemic, but rather oligarchs and fascism. I will not back down from calling it what it is. Any historian can draw parallels in actions between now and 90 years ago. I do not wish to fearmonger, but I have to call it what it is. What is under our influence in this Assembly is how we encourage the Premier to work for residents on behalf of Team Canada. Our territory holds vast resources, not only that of critical minerals, but also fresh water. These resources are attractive to external actors. I expect conversations far beyond my pay grade and influence are happening. And if they're not, I urge the Premier to insist conversations for smart and sustainable development and trade with respectful partners happens. The on-again, off-again tariffs have a feeling of smoke and mirrors for what is to come. We have an exceptional opportunity to strongly advocate for what the people of the territory need and what we have to offer the world. NWT Critical Minerals can power Canadian Green New Deal, creating jobs, prosperity, and clean energy for the NWT and beyond. We can demonstrate Northern resolve to reach net zero in the face of climate disasters. We can punch above our weight in so many ways. It's utterly heartbreaking to watch the news and feel powerless, but knowing that my friends in America are terrified. Focusing on real and tangible ways to untangle ourselves is a way to show real leadership, and it is a positive step. I'll have questions for the Premier. Thank you.
Thank you, member from Great Slave. Colleagues, before we continue on with member statements, I'd like to recognize Mayor Frank Hope of Norman Wells. He's been the mayor since 2018, and he's done a great job, and I had the opportunity to talk to him yesterday for a little bit, and I think some of you members and cabinet ministers had the opportunity to talk with him. And continue your advocacy, Mr. Hope. Member statements. A member from Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these days we are bombarded with news of doom and war and conflict coming from every corner of our country and the world. There are looming trade wars, military wars where civilians are being bombed, wars between political parties, wars on the street between drug lords and gangs. Everywhere, life as we know it is being torn down. In our own territory, everyone is worried that the government is broke, worried that our whole focus is finding programs and services and jobs to cut. It feels like our world is closing in, that it's getting smaller and more fragmented. And with that, our hope and our vision for the future gets smaller too. We see other communities, other leaders as competitors, even enemies. And then we start to give up on our own communities and on ourselves. Mr. Speaker, no one can thrive with that kind of mentality, and it's no way to lead a government. And I firmly believe that we don't have to operate that way, even with our current fiscal limitations. The only path forward, I'm convinced, is to build up. Yes, we need to be way more careful with our spending. And maybe some old buildings and programs do need to be torn down. But we need to be absolutely clear what better things we're replacing them with. We are not broke. We need to be more careful with our spending, but cuts are not the goal. They're a means to an end. So what is the end? The point is to focus our limited resources on the things that really matter. A healthcare system where every resident in every community has access to quality primary care. Communities where every resident has access to a safe home that they can take pride in. Cultivating a skilled workforce and businesses that are really good at what they do. Mr. Speaker, these are the priorities we've identified, and yet we've failed to lay out any kind of plan to achieve any of them, so no wonder the public has totally lost the plot on what we're actually trying to build up. Mr. Speaker, this work is too important for us to waste energy fighting and tearing each other down. It's going to take all of us staying focused on our positive vision for the future, opportunities to work together, and letting go of the things that don't matter as much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member from Yellowknife North. Member statement. Member from the Sawtooth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The town of Norman Wells issued a state of emergency back in October 2024. At the time, I spoke in this House about the Emergency Management Act and suggested that there could be opportunities for territorial and federal support to help mitigate the high cost of living in Norman Wells. Mr. Speaker, now Imperial Oil Resources is discussing shutting down its operations in the community. Mr. Speaker, it has been reported by Imperial and the media that the Norman Wells oil field, which is more than a century old, has at most another 5 or 10 years life before closure. This will be shortened without regulatory approvals. The transition process, Mr. Speaker, is just beginning, and eventually 60 employees as well as visiting contractors will have to find new opportunities or new work. This closure, Mr. Speaker, will put further economic strain on the community of Norman Wells. Something must be done now to ensure there is hope for the future for the residents. Mr. Speaker, the GWT must make good on its mandate to build a strong economic foundation. Mr. Speaker, the residents of Norman Wells are starting to think about the town, what the town will look like post-closure. They are looking at ways they can transition from being dependent on Imperial for home heating oil, electricity, to become a self-supporting community. Mr. Speaker, later I intend to table documents at the appropriate time with the anticipation to initiate a joint collaboration framework, alternatively a sustainable working group for this challenge. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member from the Sawtooth. Member statements. Member from Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to express concern over potential changes to the quarry permitting process in the Northwest Territories. As it stands, land and water boards, established under the land claim agreements, already conduct thorough screenings and consultation when reviewing land use permits and project determinations. This system has worked effectively, Mr. Speaker, for years, ensuring proper oversight while allowing projects to proceed in a timely manner. Now, Mr. Speaker, the GNWT is considering adding an additional consultation requirement at the quarry permit stage. This unnecessary step duplicates existing processes and creates delays and uncertainty for contractors, particularly when project material needs change or contracts are awarded late in the year. Mr. Speaker, in the Beaufort Delta, we only have a short summer construction season, and any added delay could mean lost work and increased costs for businesses. There's been no clear explanation as to why this change is needed. If the GNWT believes additional consultation is required, we should be looking at solutions that streamline efforts, not complicate them. A protocol agreement with the Land and Water Boards could ensure consultation obligations are met without causing project delays. Mr. Speaker, no changes should be made to the existing process until a clear policy is developed with defined timelines and transition period for contractors. We cannot afford to add more red tape when our industries and communities rely on efficient permitting to support economic growth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll have questions for the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, member from Nunavut Lake. Member statements. Member from Frame Lake.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last sitting, I raised the issue of respite care in the Territory and conferred with the Minister of Health that the Department is reviewing its delivery of respite care. I've since met with some constituents and received feedback about some things that we could be doing differently. Mr. Speaker, currently the Territory is spending a significant amount of money on out-of-territory care. Each individual who is sent south costs anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 per month or more, which adds up to $600,000 per year per person. In total, the program is costing us $50 million per year. One question that has come up is, could we prevent more people from being sent south for both respite or long-term supported living if we were able to better support families to keep their loved ones at home? This could take several different forms. One idea is an income support program for at-home caregivers if they are able to prevent their loved one from being sent south. Another idea raised by a constituent would be funding for families to hire their own at-home caregiver for full-time or respite services. The idea would be to empower people to come up with their own solutions and support them to do so. Considering the significant costs associated with out-of-territory care, even if such programs were quite expensive to deliver per person, I think there's a good chance it could be less expensive, potentially even significantly so, than what we're paying now. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, it would ensure loved ones are kept at home where they belong, with their families. Programs such as income support or subsidies for families could be done alongside existing programming and offer additional options, giving families the agency to decide for themselves what works best. Looking at the potential for this kind of programming is something I think we need to be focusing on in a time of fiscal restraint. I know that we aren't in the best position to be expanding our own programming at this time. Establishing funding pots like what I've described is one way we might be able to help people without expanding our own services. To that end, I'll have questions for the Minister of Health today and also for the Minister of ECC if there's time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member from Frame Lake. Member statements. Member from Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take the opportunity on the first day of this sitting to wish all of my constituents in the Decho a Happy New Year. To all the residents in the communities of Fort Providence, Kakisa, Enterprise, and Catlodici, I wish you all the best in 2025. And I want to congratulate the community of Fort Providence for the excellent Christmas parade and first night New Year celebrations that happened in the New Year. These events brought people together to celebrate the holiday season and enjoy each other's company. A special thanks to Andrew Nunes, the Hamlet of Fort Providence, the Gakoti First Nations, and the dedicated team of volunteers that worked tirelessly to make this celebration a success for the community. To my colleagues here in the House, Happy New Year. To my husband Norman and family, thank you for supporting me always. May 2025 bring you prosperity and happiness. I look forward to the work we will accomplish together for the people of this beautiful territory we call home. There is value in working together, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
You're here. Thank you, member from the Decho. Member statements. Member from Range Lake.
Mr. Speaker, we are in a war, a trade war. And while our efforts have earned a 30-day reprieve, there's still much work to be done towards a resolution. Canadians are still struggling to come to terms with the sudden betrayal of one of our oldest allies that has upended the North American economy. I know Northerners are worried, and by virtue of having the earliest legislative session this year, we get to demonstrate that leadership with the first opportunity to formally address the illegal tariffs threatened by U.S. President Donald Trump. Today, let us reaffirm our commitment to upholding our sovereignty and taking all necessary action to support a Team Canada approach against the threat to our communities. Monsieur le Président, les Canadiens et Canadiennes sont fiers de savoir que notre
Mr. Chair, we are very happy to see that our country is the largest in the world with more than 10 million square kilometers, but only a small part of our population is found in 250 kilometers from the border. As an individual living in the remote areas of the Arctic, a large part of the Canadians or Americans
que ce que l'on peut en voir en consultant une carte.
can only know where we live by looking at a map. In fact, these are the people who have been living on these on this land since immemorial times, and all the colonials that really define the sovereignty of Canada.
We've always had friends and allies who have helped us in this task of keeping our communities safe. And Canadians and Americans have stood shoulder to shoulder for over a century, fighting in 2 world wars where the resources of the Northwest Territories played a crucial role in ending those conflicts, and thereafter to defend against the threat of the Soviet Union by building and operating the DEW line that stretched from Alaska to Nunavut. My father was a civilian contractor on the DEW line for NORAD, and our relationship with the U.S. is the reason my family is here in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, it is my hopes that none of this trade war comes to pass, and that the dumbest trade war in history ends without a shot being fired. But if there is a silver lining to an unpredictable U.S. president, it's that his irrational behavior proves that it is Canada that must invest in the Northwest Territories. We need to eliminate internal trade barriers, reduce regulatory burdens, and expand our military infrastructure with an ambitious strategy to expand development and open up new markets. To Canadians, thank you for standing up for your country and against those who would do us harm. To Americans, remember we are your friends and neighbors, not your enemies. And to Northerners, your government will see you through this crisis and keep the true North strong and free. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Member from Range Lake. Member statements. Member from Yonge Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with 971 days left in this Assembly, time moves along fast. But I say to this government, we need to be relentless and unapologetic for our fight for Northerners, for a better tomorrow, and certainly much better than yesterday was. Time is ticking away, Mr. Speaker. As their GDP does slip away, we need the government to take a full court press, not the wait-and-see policy we've lived with over and over and over again. Kind of a Groundhog's Day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need action, boldness, commitment, Mr. Speaker, without apology. Mr. Speaker, Premier Doug Ford may not be my personal cup of tea, but no one in this country can argue he takes bold action, he believes in the economy, he believes in Ontario, and as a matter of fact, he's putting those words to fight for Canada, Mr. Speaker. We need that energy. We need a playbook just like Mr. Ford, Mr. Speaker. I should say Premier Ford. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't be ashamed to stand our ground as Northerners, but find common ground through experience, talent, kindness, and a collective focus. Mr. Speaker, we need a Premier's State of the Union like we heard yesterday, but with actual energy and deliverable tangibles. Mr. Speaker, I listened carefully. There were no unicorns or rainbows in that speech of success. Now, my definition may be different than his, but Mr. Speaker, we're not hearing inspiration. We're hearing the bureaucracies running the show. Mr. Speaker, all members can agree in one form or another. We may not like all the styles of development and opportunity, but let us be on the same page. We may all agree we hate poverty, and so we have to reach for and grab any opportunity we can. With Canada's commitment towards the 2% NATO spending, Mr. Speaker, time is ticking on that one, including the opportunities to get on board and to be part of those billions of dollars that are being invested and looked towards the future of meeting those commitments. Mr. Speaker, I say seize the day, Mr. Premier, with our national interest. Show them we will be the partner to build that Mackenzie Valley Highway for national interest. We will be the partner that will build the Bathurst Port Road all the way up to the Arctic, Mr. Speaker. We will be the partner to have airports in the NWT for those F-35s that will be here to protect our national interests, Mr. Speaker. I say to the Premier, opportunities knocking, don't miss the boat. Mr. Speaker, I finish with this. I implore the Premier to lead, seize the day, or certainly get out of the way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member from Yellowknife Centre. Member statements. Member from Hay River South.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome back all my colleagues to the Legislative Assembly, welcome back all the staff, and welcome back all the interpreters to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, this past weekend, Hay River hosted the territorial trials for the Montana's Briar, which, by the way, is being held February 28th to March 9th in Kelowna, BC. I'd like to think this is the Hay River's unofficial warm-up before we send our champions to Kelowna to battle the best curlers out there. I'm proud to announce that the Hay River team will be representing the Northwest Territories at this prestigious event. Mr. Speaker, congratulations to the team from Hay River, Aaron Bartling, the former Speaker of the House's son, Darcy Delory, Norm Bassett of Hay River, and Eric Preston, an RCMP officer, all in Hay River. They managed to take down Team Cooey in a 7-6 victory in extra ends. That's like an overtime victory in curling for us hockey fans. I was there, I watched it, it was pretty intense, and it came down to the last rock. I believe this is the first time in Hay River history that a team has represented the NWT at a men's Briar, and for that, it's a pretty big deal. Also, a huge shout out to the Curling Club in Hay River and the volunteers that made this event a success. Without them, this achievement would have been a little bit more difficult. Congratulations to Team Delory/Bartling, and I look forward to watching them on TV. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member from Hay River South. Member statements. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to advise you this is going to be a very difficult celebration of life to do. Avery Julianne Burke was born May 4th, 2018 at BC Women's Hospital to Maureen Deneron and Preston Burke. She was the third youngest of 4 siblings. She spent her first 2 years of her life in Fort Nelson, BC before moving to Summit Cay with her grandmother, Bertha Deneron. Avery loved being with her grandmother. She was a great help to her grandmother. She loved helping to do dishes, folding clothes, all the while singing away to various songs. Her favorite music was the fiddle, especially when her sister Katrina played the fiddle. She would grab her little brother's hand and they would dance up a storm. Their smiles made the home even brighter. She was a very outdoor type of person. She loved to put up rabbit snares and chairs when she was successful. Even at a young age, she was able to remove the snares without much trouble, thanks to her grandmother's teaching. She liked to go chicken hunting with her sisters, who was a good shot. Once they got a chicken, she would get right to the task of plucking it. She would be heard saying, "We got Grandma's supper," with a big smile. Avery loved to look for animal tracks, especially in the winter. She was always curious about the various animals, their tracks, and asked tons of questions about them and their home. Like a true northerner, her favorite food was dry meat, dry fish, bannock, fruit, and moose meat with broth. Her sister Katrina liked spending time with her, making endless drawings or letting her be part of whatever her and her other sister were doing. I can tell you, she didn't seem to have a bad day. She loved to laugh, dance, sing with her siblings, especially with her cousin Peyton. When it came to school, she had a huge passion for it. She loved her teachers and classmates. She would go to bed Sunday excited because because they're going to go to school starting Monday morning. She would get to learn and see her teacher and classmates. When she had time, she loved spending time with her baby brother. They would enjoy playing together, and she would teach him how to do things. As the family said, she was their little ray of sunshine. She was so innocent and intelligent. She was way too precious for this world and had to leave us. I can tell you, before she passed away on January 4th, she told her mother that she was going to come back as a big tree to look after her baby brother. She was deeply loved and will be tenderly missed by her family and friends. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of the visitors in the gallery. Member from Nunavut-Bootlake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to recognize and more importantly thank Sheila Nasagalawak, my constituency assistant from Inuvik. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Seeing nobody else recognizing visitors, for the others that are here, thank you very much for allowing us to be in your home, and welcome to our proceedings. It's great to have visitors here at this time. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member from Range Lake. Range Lake, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the Premier for his team, for being part of the Team Canada response to the U.S. Tariff threat, and I'd like to ask today what the status of that approach is. Where are Canada's premiers and the Prime Minister on ensuring that we can overcome this challenge to our economic sovereignty in the next 30 days? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member from Range Lake. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure everyone has heard that the Prime Minister spoke with President Trump yesterday, I believe it was Monday. They had a discussion, and President Trump said that he was going to delay the implementation of the tariffs by 30 days, and so that's where we are right now. Across Canada, governments, provincial and territorial governments, we're going to enact measures, just as ours was. For example, removing American products from the liquor stores, stopping procurement of American goods, and any other tariff measures that we can find to help support these efforts. We've paused those efforts, as I believe most jurisdictions have, but we haven't stopped preparing. So we're continuing to prepare, continuing to examine what other non-tariff options that we have and how we can better support Team Canada. I had a call today with the Prime Minister and all of the premiers. We had one on Saturday, we had one last week, and all of the jurisdictions are doing what they can. I can tell you it's a very cohesive group despite any political differences across party lines. It is a united Team Canada approach from coast to coast to coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Oral questions. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Premier. I mean, I'm jealous I'm not part of those calls because it'd be great to call Donald Trump's bluff and beat him at his own game. So thank you for that. Mr. Speaker, have the Canada's premiers had a discussion about eliminating interprovincial trade barriers? Winning this war is one thing, but we have to build for the future. That's a big part of this. So what progress are we making on eliminating interprovincial trade barriers? Thank you.
Good. Member from Range Lake, Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a committee in Canada that is made up of all 13 provinces and territories, as well as the federal government. That's the Committee on Internal Trade. Each year, a different jurisdiction chairs that committee. Starting in 2025, the NWT is the chair of the Committee on Internal Trade. Last week, Minister Cleveland called an emergency meeting of the committee. They met on Friday, and they brought forward recommendations. They're very high-level recommendations, but they speak to many of the things the member's talking about. We are looking to reduce internal trade barriers across Canada in a serious way. And we're looking to increase labor mobility. And so the work is underway. Both of these are issues that have been long-standing in Canada, and there hasn't been the political will to actually get them dealt with. They do take a lot of work. It will take legislative change across every jurisdiction. It'll take some jurisdictions giving up a sacred cow that they just don't want to. But if there ever was a political will to make that work happen, now is the time. And if we do that, even if we cut our trade barriers by half, we're going to see an impact on our Canada-wide GDP. And so it's a real effort to make real change in Canada, and I'm very hopeful that we're going to see that change soon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is good news as well. Mr. Speaker, another thing that this crisis has prompted is taking a look at energy security in Canada. We're talking about getting oil and gas to market, or to ports, and finding new ports. The Northwest Territories is one of the largest supplies of oil and gas in the world. Can the Premier tell us if he is pursuing that opportunity, and how we are going to unlock this resource to benefit not only Canada's security, but Northern security as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Member from Range Lake. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and probably a question more suited for the Industry Minister, because I know that work has been going on in this area, especially up in the Beaufort Delta region, and there's a lot of hope about what that could bring. The resource that we have right now that a lot of the world's attention is on is critical minerals. And so I'm having lots of conversations at the First Minister's meetings that I just mentioned, as well as virtually everywhere I go, because we recognize we need secure supply chains in Canada. If there are tariffs from the United States, that disrupts supply chains. We have tariffs with China. We can't necessarily always rely on China to provide what we need. And so now is the time that we as a country need to come together and ensure that we have sustainable supply chains so that we can create prosperity for Canada. We can do mining here, we can do refining here, we can do manufacturing here, and we can have the innovation industry to develop those products that we're manufacturing. We can do it all in Canada, Mr. Speaker, and there's a real push underway right now to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Final supplementary. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier withhold the NWT's critical minerals from imports or exports to America? Thank you. Tariffs.
Thank you, Member from Range Lake. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a decision of the federal government, and the federal government has said everything's on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Oral questions. Member from Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, will be asking questions of the Premier. I'd like to reflect back my questions towards my member statement regarding NATO's 2% spending requirement. And for the record, I believe, if I'm correct, Canada currently commits 1.37% of our GDP towards it. So that's billions of dollars before falling short of that commitment. So my question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is simply, what is the government doing on the projects and initiatives I had pointed out in my speech with respect to the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Bathurst Port, including the expansion of Northern Airways to suit the F-35s, to get national investment in our northern economy? Thank you.
Thank you, Member from Yellowknife Centre. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So an update on F-35 facilities, the Mackenzie Valley Highway, and the Bathurst Port. So that's quite a bit of information. I don't think I can get it all to the Minister here, but I've met with the Minister of National Defence, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Northern Affairs, and these are what the topics that we talk about. I have these same conversations with my Northern Premier colleagues, and together we push for infrastructure development in the North, and I know that the Prime Minister is listening and has unprompted reiterated those comments back. And so I know that that is on their mind, and they recognize the importance of this. And so we are always pushing these projects. I'll leave it there. I won't get too far into the details of where we are with these projects, timelines, and things like that. Probably better suited for a different minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Premier. Member from Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, listening is great, but it doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't put gas in the car, it doesn't buy Christmas presents, etc., Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to ask the Premier, what type of campaign is the territorial government doing through his Department of Executive to launch and suggest this is the best investment opportunity for the North, but it's also the best investment for them to help meet their 2% requirements? Thank you.
Member from Yellowknife Centre. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, the eyes of the world are on the North now. and the discussions about Arctic security and defense have taken up an inordinate amount of my time. I can say I did not expect this when I became the Premier of the Northwest Territories. I'd be having these national discussions and international discussions, but the fact is we are. And so what I can do from my end as a politician is talk to the politicians who are making decisions about what we need for infrastructure. And so we have provided detailed information to the federal government about the types of projects that we want to advance. When it comes to military installations, that's federal government jurisdiction, but I've told the federal government we need to work with them on those. We need to ensure that any military facilities in the north provide benefits to the north, and that the Indigenous governments on whose land those facilities are need to be part of those discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Member for Milne Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the Premier what type of proactive, aggressive campaign are we selling? When the territorial government went so far as building the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway, it wasn't just cap in hand saying, we'll wait till they do this. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the Premier, is he willing to look at either striking a formal committee to get members, including Cabinet, to work on an aggressive campaign to sell these types of initiatives? Because if we sit here and do nothing, that's exactly what we'll get. Being polite, but we'll be overlooked. Thank you.
Member for Milne Centre. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a team to sell these projects to the federal government. It's your Executive Council, it's Cabinet, and we do it every single day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Final supplementary. Member for Milne Centre.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, this is the first time I've heard of this Cabinet team that's been selling this. I've not seen in 1 year any result of that. Hence, I'll ask the question, would the Premier be willing to form a working group with some regular members so we can help push this initiative collectively and territorially so we don't miss this billion-dollar opportunity? Thank you.
For Milne Centre. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the member wants to put a framework around this amorphous idea of pushing for billion-dollar opportunities, I'd be happy to have a look at that and consider how we can use that, but I'm not going to spearhead the member's initiative. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Premier. Oral questions. Member from Sawtooth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today my questions are to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. On the Public Lands Act, last spring, I brought this forward. Today I'm asking questions on the progress. My first question there, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister share what regulatory drafting progress has been made to date? Masi.
Thank you. Member from the Sawtooth. Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Public Lands Act was passed in the 19th Legislative Assembly. Regulations are required to bring the Act into force. This government is committed to working collaboratively with our Indigenous government partners through the Intergovernmental Council on the development of the lands and resource legislation and regulation. The Public Lands Act and regulation is one of the pieces of the legislation that is moving through the process right now. There's currently a technical working group under the Intergovernmental Council Secretariat, which includes representatives from NWT, Indigenous governments and organizations, and the GNWT, working together collaboratively to develop regulations under the Public Lands Act. There are a few issues that still remain outstanding to the technical working group, and they are being discussed and considered by the group at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Oral questions. Member from Sawtooth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that update. My second question on the same subject, on the Public Lands Act. Can the Minister update the Assembly on the next steps on the process? Masi.
Member from the Sawtooth. Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Our hope is to reach consensus with the technical working group very soon, which will allow us to proceed to the next steps in the process. Once the technical working group has reached consensus, The next step would be to re-engage with the technical advisory panel made of interested public stakeholder groups, and the proposed regulations would be discussed at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Member from the Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that information. I'm sure our audience are listening. My third question is on the timeline for the completion of this. Can the Minister share that? Thank you.
From the Sudbury. Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we work through this process, like I said, at the technical working group level, and as we move on to the final stages, our hope is to have this work completed and have the draft final regulations prepared by the late to end of summer of 2025. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Oral questions. Member from Frame Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, I misspoke earlier. I meant that I would be asking questions of the Minister of EC at a later time. She's clearly not here today. But my questions for today are for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Health have information regarding how many people receiving out-of-territory care are due to lack of ability of an in-home caregiver as opposed to complex needs that simply can't be addressed in the territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Frame Lake, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we currently don't have that specific data, as I don't have that data, but I can tell you that there are 147 NWT residents receiving out-of-territory care. There are also 55 clients within the Northwest Territories receiving supportive living services. To be eligible for out-of-territory supportive living program, there must be evidence that their support needs cannot be met within the Northwest Territories. But I can confirm that the department is undertaking an analysis of the support needs of the out-of-territory clients to inform models and resources needed for in-territory supportive living services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Minister of Health and Social Services. Member from Frame Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I look forward to seeing the results of that further investigation. Mr. Speaker, how much is the GNWT currently spending on sending clients for short-term or respite-related stays in the South? Thank you.
Member from Frame Lake, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Territory currently does not send short-term respite stays. They're not part of the out-of-territory supportive living program. Therefore, no funds are being spent on this. There are, however, oftentimes when families have, reached capacity and when they're providing services, and sometimes, those needs are so complex that end up, there's an admission into our healthcare system, into our hospitals, but there isn't a short-term out-of-territory program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services. Member from Frame Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate that clarification. Mr. Speaker, has the GNWT explored options before for programs such as income support or grants for families supporting persons with disabilities to organize their own in-home services or respite care? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Frame Lake, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, the model of individualized funding for supportive living has been identified as a recommendation in the supportive living review of 2023. The department has established a working group to examine the resources that would be required to establish these types of options for Northwest Territories residents, and this work is in progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Health and Social Services. Final supplementary, member from Frame Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see, as part of that work, analysis of whether the Territory could save some of the money that's being spent on out-of-territory service for the reasons I spoke to today. Does the Minister have a timeline for the Assembly as to when she expects to see the conclusion of this investigation? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can get back to the member of an update or a timeline of this review. I would like to, however, say that a lot of the things that were in the review, the supportive living review of 2023, those that have been able to be completed internally, and so this review is some of the stuff that's being done internally to analyze those clients that are out of territory, bringing them back if they're what that might look like. But again, that many of the things that haven't, the recommendations that have been accepted of this report also need funding to go along to implement. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Health and Social Services. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions today are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. So one of this Assembly's priorities is improving access to primary care. Just so everyone's clear, primary care is the first place people go for health advice and care, whether that's a community health center or a family doctor. So has this government defined anywhere what exactly improving access to primary care means to us and what we're trying to accomplish? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Yellowknife North, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just want to say, I've had ongoing conversations with the member, and every time we have this dialogue, there are more things that come to light, and so having these conversations here in this House, but also having this conversation with my counterparts last week in Halifax with all of the federal, provincial, territorial ministers. And saying healthcare across Canada is changing, and it's not just changing in Canada and Northwest Territories, it's changing around the world. So people having to access care, we're moving away from the traditional model of having one family doctor for life is no longer realistic. The demands for family physicians at an all-time high right across Canada. So, over the life of this legislative assembly, our priority is equitable access to health care. Particularly, we have a high number of non-Indigenous clients who are on the higher end of chronic disease rates throughout our territory. So we are organizing our system so that every resident has access to the care that they need to reach their full health and wellness potential, while the system actively works to remove barriers to this equitable access. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Health and Social Services. Member from Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so that's a good start in terms of our overarching goals. But for example, the primary care reform carried out in Yellowknife, at least last year, seems to have been done as kind of a trial, something we'll try out and see if it works. But has anyone defined what exactly our primary care reform was trying to accomplish? And how will we know if this trial has worked if we don't have indicators or targets about what it was supposed to accomplish? How will we know if our primary care reform is working? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Yellowknife North, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, the primary care reform is the overall the providing of care to all residents in the Northwest Territories. As the member has stated, in Yellowknife, there has been some changes within the program itself. It went from primary care teams of 10, which did not include, all of those teams did not include physicians on every team. Some of them didn't include community health nurses on those teams. Those teams didn't include LPNs. They didn't include the holistic wellness worker. So what happened was that there was too many teams spread out too thin, and so what they've done now is they've amalgamated the 4 teams in Yellowknife, and they've created it so that every team has a physician, every team has a CHR, every team has an LPN, there's administrative, there's holistic, and every person in the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife that needs to access and is assigned to these teams as they access care, that they will see the person on the team that meets whatever their need is, so the level of care, so that every practitioner there is working at the scope of their practice. They're all professionals in their workforce, and it's not one over the other. And so those that are seeing the physicians are those that are needing to see physicians with the chronic diseases and the complex cases that physicians are working with at their scope of practice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services. Final supplementary. Member from Yellowknife North.
Can we have 4 today? We just have 3?
Okay, sorry.
So, do we have a way of checking in after a year or 2 years with patients in Yellowknife to see if what the minister described has actually happened, whether people are able to access the right practitioner at the right scope? So do we have a way of checking in with both patients as to whether it's working well and with the practitioners themselves to see if the theory of how this system is supposed to work is actually working for people at the end of the day? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Yellowknife North, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every year, I believe, the Health Authority does quality patient they do surveys, so patients coming in, they can take the surveys, they're offered the surveys. If there's online, you can call Quality Risk if there's concerns. One of the things that we have to take into consideration when we're measuring all of the programs in health, we measure them with our outcomes, and so when we have our statistics through CIHI, like we can see whether or not our chronic diseases are increasing or decreasing, the access to physician care, we get those updates, but to have that specific detail that the member is asking for, I can bring that back to NTHSSA to see what internally that they are doing to audit the changes in their system, and I can commit to bringing that back to the members for their review. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services. I'll try this again. Member from Yellowknife North, final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, as the minister alluded to earlier, we need to always remember that primary care is happening in every community health center across the territory. So how has our primary care reform that's taken place taken into consideration how community health center operations will be impacted, or where the opportunities are for better supports and connections between doctors and practitioners in regional centers and the community health nurses in small communities? How has that been part of the reform process? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Yellowknife North, Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that the member asked this question, because this piece here is near and dear to my heart, and this is what the direction that was given to the department as part of this is reviewing our staffing models in our health centers, and not just our centers that currently have nurses, but all health centers across the territory. We have 9 communities that have they have a CHR, and if we're lucky, they have a home support worker in those communities. We need to be looking at, the incidence of how much, times these clients are having to travel to access services, and what the cost is of bringing those services closer. So this review of going on across right now with our nursing leadership is reviewing our model of care in our health centers, which will identify, the need, because in the past we were working on a federal model, and many of the nurses were put into these health centers, were given housing, were giving, and this is the model we're currently working on. And over the years we've tweaked it, and we've added in home support workers to support, but we need to take a real look at the needs of our small communities and making sure that they're getting the preventative support services that they're needing, so that their emergency services that's not all that they're dealing with. And so that's what's happening throughout. And some of those communities having access to nurse practitioners, if we can get more nurse practitioners to be working with all of our communities, and then the needs of physicians when they're needed by the residents, that can limit the amount of travel. We all talk about the travel that we're spending on our residents in the Northwest Territories. So this is a whole part of what's going on right now with the medical travel, the modernization, and the health center and the primary care reform. So there's a whole bunch of things that are kind of working right now that are taking place, and hopefully that will help to streamline and strengthen our access to care in the Northwest Territories for our residents. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services. Oral questions. Member from Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also want to thank my colleagues for speaking to this, generally the topic of tariffs in Team Canada today. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier seize this opportunity to encourage a Green New Deal for the NWT and critical minerals, working in tandem with Team Canada and Indigenous leadership? And I'm specifically asking this of the Premier because he's at those tables, not the Minister of ITI. Thank you.
Thank you. Member from Great Slave. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to stay away from the term Green New Deal. That's politically charged and comes with a lot of baggage. But I am working to drum up investment in critical minerals, explain the importance of critical minerals to the rest of Canada, and let them know what we have here in the Northwest Territories. And I know the message has been heard because I hear it when I travel and meet with other ministers or premiers. And so we really are pushing that angle, and I'll continue to do so. Thank you.
Mr. Premier. Member from Great Slave.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's a real opportunity here to not only be punching above our weight, as I said in my statement, but also to show leadership in the availability of critical minerals in our territory. But as the Premier knows, we don't make a lot of money off of resource royalties right now. Will there be a redesign of royalties coming back into the territory to help us meet both the GNWT's endless infrastructure and social spending deficits and those of our Indigenous partners? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Great Slave. Mr. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, revenue royalties are under the Minister of ITI, so I can't speak to that. My primary concern is getting some investment into the territory, and getting some development, getting people working, and of course doing it in a sustainable way. That's one thing that we always have to balance in the Northwest Territories. The people of the Northwest Territories, they still live on the land. They still hunt, they still fish, they still trap, and many communities supplement their incomes and their food through those methods. So while we have that consideration, we also have a maturing regulatory regime, and we are constantly working to streamline it, ensure that we're working more closely with proponents so that they know what we want out of our regulatory system. We don't leave them guessing. And I'm advocating always for more support for Indigenous governments to be part of that process. If you have a small Indigenous government with an unsettled land claim, they can't deal with dozens and dozens and dozens of exploration companies who are coming trying to consult, and that creates a bottleneck. And so we need to support the Indigenous governments as well to get things going. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member from Nunavut Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, following up on my member statement over potential changes to the quarry permitting. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister explain why the GNWT is considering additional consultation requirements for quarry permits and when Land and Water Boards already conduct consultation as part of the permitting process? Thank you.
Member from Nunavut Lake. Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, consultation undertaken under the quarry permits is not additional consultation to that undertaken by the Land and Water Boards for the land use permits. Quarry permits and land use permits are two different authorizations under two separate authorities and under two separate pieces of legislation. Quarry permits are issued by the GNWT, where land use permits are issued by the appropriate Land and Water Board across the NWT, except for in the ISR. For a quarry permit operations, for quarry operations, both a quarry permit and a land use permit are required. For example, the land use permit grants access to use heavy equipment on the site, while the quarry permit provides the access to the granular material and the authorization to use that material. Any consultation undertaken on a quarry permit is specific to that actual activity, the use of the material itself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Member from Nunavut Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister. So, from what I understand from quarry permit holders in my region, they are been asked for additional consultation. I understand what the Minister is saying. So, I guess if there is a duplication, has the GNWT considered entering into a protocol agreement with the Land and Water Boards to avoid any duplication of consultation efforts while ensuring that they're still doing their duty to consult is met? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bootlick, Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned, quarry permits are not issued for the same purpose or under the same authority as the land use permit. The GNWT are unable to delegate consultation obligations for quarry permits to, for example, a land and water board or other organizations that may issue land use permits. The department were always interested in considering ways to better coordinate processes and with other regulatory agencies, and I will ask the department to explore any possibilities in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Member from Nunavut, Bootlick.
So, Mr. Speaker, I guess my question is simple then. Has the department or is the department looking at any potential changes to the quarry permitting process, or is it the same now as it was last year and will be the same again next year? Thank you.
From Nunavut, Bootlick, Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the department continues to use the same processes as it has in the past. But we remain committed to working with industry, stakeholders, navigating the quarry permit application process to better communicate clearly with industry as well as the other people in the territory how this whole process works. And I'll commit today to work with the member. I understand that there's a specific issue in his constituency that he would like addressed, so I'll stand here today and commit to following up with the member to better understand the issue and the details and see what we can do to alleviate that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Final supplementary. Member from Nunavut, Bootlick.
Speaker, and thank you, Minister. And yes, and I appreciate that. And the Minister, I will say, has always been willing to work with me and the Beaufort Delta when I do have concerns around this. Just one final question, and maybe a yes or no answer then. I wasn't sure if it was answered in the last one, Mr. Speaker. Are there any proposed changes to the quarry permitting process being potentially looked at by the government? Thank you.
From Nunavut, Bootlick, Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, no, there are no current changes being considered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Oral questions. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Northerners continue to be puzzled why this government is stripping away benefits that have existed for many, many years. Yes, I'm talking about the affirmative action policy changes that are leaving people who live and were born and raised in the Northwest Territories or lived half their life here, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, why they're being left out in the cold. Can the Minister explain, Minister responsible for the public service, explain why she is so determined to take this benefit away from Northerners? Thank you.
Member from Range Lake, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're not looking to take away benefits from Northerners. Firstly, the definition under the affirmative action policy isn't always what people think it is. You can be born in the Northwest Territories and move to anywhere else in Canada. You are still going to be benefiting as a P1. So it's not necessarily as simple as all that. And yet that reality has been on the books for 35 years. So there's lots of folks who come up to the north, who live in the north, who are not P1s. In fact, they have no category or status whatsoever. There's folks who may live across the border from the Northwest Territories, Smith's Landing or in Nunavut, also have no status under our human resources policy whatsoever. There's a lot of problems with what we have, and we want to get to a place where we are using an evidence-based approach to our policies, that we're trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to solve. And in this case, looking at evidence, Mr. Speaker, we have a population that we serve that's 50% Indigenous. They make up 28 to 30% of the public service. They have an unemployment rate of 14%. This is a problem that we need to solve. It's high time we solved it, and that's what we're trying to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree the public service should be representative of the people it serves. How is encouraging more Southern Indigenous people to work for the public service representative of the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Thank you, member from Range Lake. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's not been a time that I've suggested that what we're trying to do is encouraging the southern, a whole host of folks from the southern parts of Canada to come to the Northwest Territories. I'd be actually quite interested to see if there was suddenly a lineup at the border of folks wanting to come for the public service here. Might be suggestive of this being a very positive place to come and work. And Mr. Speaker, our population has been stagnant for 20 years. Right now, over the last 4 years, the average population growth for the Northwest Territories is at the absolute bottom of Canada. And what we have done, and while we tried to make change that we did earlier or initially, opening this to Indigenous persons, there are many Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories who may not be members of groups who are within this boundary, who are members of, for example, of the Council of Leaders, and we were trying to simply reflect that reality here. Mr. Speaker, I was happy to take this back to Cabinet and suggest that we re-examine that. Obviously, our relationships with Indigenous governments here are very important to us, but at no time, Mr. Speaker, was there an expectation that we'd suddenly see an influx of folks. This always has been about ensuring that the people who are in the North, and specifically the Indigenous people in the North, would receive some form of priority in our hiring. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So how has the policy changed, Mr. Speaker? The minister spoke of bringing it back to the Council of Leaders. Has the policy changed since what members have been told? Thank you.
Member from Range Lake, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when this first went out a year ago, or about 2023 rather, for rounds of consultation, the proposal was to do an approach where we would have First Nations, Inuit, Métis persons or members or descendants from groups within the Northwest Territories boundaries as a first priority, and all Indigenous Canadians second priority. As I said, there are a number of people within the Northwest Territories, Indigenous, who part of that process and said, look, this doesn't capture me, please can we be more inclusive? Again, there's no policy that's going to be perfect here. So we went with the one version. Obviously, the last several weeks have suggested that that was not a version that the majority of residents or the MLAs wanted to see. So we have gone back, and I've had Cabinet suggest that we revisit that original definition, go back to the idea of having Indigenous Canadians, but with first priority to those with membership or who are descendants of the Northwest Territories. I am saying this as a proposal because, again, I had hoped that rather than making a decision, that I'd have an opportunity to take that to my MLA colleagues before bringing it back to Cabinet for a final decision. We are looking to maintain our April 1st change date. A lot of work's gone into the change management of this process, and I'm hopeful we'll make it. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Final supplementary. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then I would suggest bringing it to committee before you bring it to the media. That's just a tip for the minister. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that Indigenous people will be better represented by this change potentially. I think we still need to have conversations about it. But what about Black, brown people, women, people with disabilities, people who are covered by the ONIF policy? Is the minister taking DEI on the anti-DEI train that Donald Trump is on, or are we just leaving these people out in the cold too? The old policy covered this. It was around diversity, around ensuring no one was left behind. The assumption that P2s are all white people of privilege is a false assumption. So what is the minister doing to ensure that other minority populations in the Northwest Territories are being protected by our hiring policies? Thank you.
Member from Range Lake, Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, take a look at Hansard and decide whether or not a comparison between myself and Minister Trump or Mr. Trump warrants some further procedural question. I'm going to leave it alone for the moment, and I can, as I said, look back at Hansard and can make that consideration in due course. Mr. Speaker, I certainly did attempt to take this back to committee. I actually was able to arrange an opportunity to meet with committee, but the committee declined to meet with me, and then because of all the things that had gone to the media, including confidential letters marked from my office to committee, I had an inundation of requests to speak to the media. I have done my best to try to indicate that this was still something under consideration in those interviews. And Mr. Speaker, with respect to other members of the population of the Northwest Territories, again, we want the Northwest Territories Public Service to be inclusive and diverse. This is one piece of a much bigger puzzle that we're trying to solve here to make this a better workforce. There's a number of different initiatives underway, including not least of which is the Diversity and Inclusion Framework, which is fairly new. It has rolled out, it is being implemented, and Mr. Speaker, the idea here is to get at the root of actually understanding when there is bias in a workplace, when there's maybe unconscious bias, ensuring that our workplaces are ones that are welcoming, diverse, acceptable, that persons can go and work there without and feel welcome when they are there. And Mr. Speaker, we are most certainly committed to that as a policy of the Northwest Territories government. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Oral questions. Member from Yonge Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to follow up on a question I had asked the Minister of Housing some time ago. I'd written her an email about naming one of the downtown buildings, the Whitford Building. I again brought it up in October, asking about that. I talked about the policy, non-policy constraints, other than the fact that she wanted to say there's a process. Frankly, the minister is in charge of this process, can present to cabinet. We have not just one building that's established, but we also have two more buildings coming on stream in the near future. Would the minister be willing to name one of the three buildings, whether it's the new housing building, whether it's the Whitford Healing Center for the new shelter, or even the downtown Barrier Free building, after Mr. Tony Whitford, who's honored this territory for decades? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Yonge Centre. Minister, Housing NT.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my discussions with Housing NWT, we are continuing to look at this, examine if naming buildings throughout the Northwest Territories for people that have done great service for the Northwest Territories, like Mr. Whitford, is appropriate. We continue to examine that because, again, we work with our leadership across the North, including the Council of Leaders, so things need to be examined carefully before announcements are made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister from Housing NWT. Member from Yonge Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of buildings. I'm not here to go through them all. Maybe we didn't need the Legislative Assembly, but we have the Joe Toby building, we have the Arthur Lang building, etc., etc. We even had the Jan Sterling building, and she was alive at the time it was named in her honor. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the minister to show some courage, some fortitude on this one, and just make a decision today and say, I will find a way to get this done, that we honor for our former commissioner in that type of method, such as naming a building either new or renewed in his honor, given the important commitment he's made to Northerners. Thank you.
Member from Yonge Centre. Minister of Housing NWT.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'll reiterate that this has to be examined, that we have to look at things, we have to be careful in what we do, and understanding the member's request, we just have to be careful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Housing NWT. Member from Yonge Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to chew up too much more time, but it just seems like, well, we're going to examine this. I mean, we could be in the 22nd Assembly from the sounds of the way that the government's moving so quickly on this. Mr. Speaker, would the minister be willing to commit to bring back a decision and direction before the end of this current sitting, showing that we're talking about this idea and be willing to make a decision? That would be grateful to me and an immense amount of Northerners who would appreciate this gesture. Thank you.
From Yonge Centre, Minister of Housing NWT.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is willing to commit that we'll come back at the end of the Assembly with a response for the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member, oral questions. Member from Yonge Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Assembly, if I said Assembly, I want to make sure I was clear. I meant the sitting, just so we're on the record. If the minister meant the Assembly in 2.5 years, I think, that's the definition of bureaucracy in the sense of, Mr. Speaker, can the minister commit to bringing back a decision and direction before the end of this sitting? Thank you.
Member from Yonge Centre. Minister of Housing NWT.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes. I meant Assembly, and again, I'll talk to the member about this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Housing NWT. Oral questions. Member from Yonge North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions now are for the Minister of Finance. So the 2023 GNWT Employee Engagement and Satisfaction Survey identified a number of sources of major dissatisfaction in GNWT workplaces, and in particular places where dissatisfaction has been growing. So I understand that in July of last year, an action plan, an employee satisfaction action plan, was released to try to address the problems. So can the Finance Minister tell us what progress is being made since this action plan was established? First, on growing concerns that GNWT workplaces are not psychologically healthy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Yellowknife North, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the line of questions. This is yet one more of the suite of things that we are trying to address and trying to implement across the human resources processes within the GNWT. We have, as a part of responding to this, now implemented the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace across the GNWT. So it creates a very specific target by which staff can understand what their rights are and what the processes are, and whereby supervisors and managers can have some toolkits available to them. With respect to that implementation specifically, training associated, Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to get some details on where we're at and what we plan to do. There is much more happening, and really one of the kind of critical things as that to actually get a more of an action plan on all of these items. Mr. Speaker, we have a committee formed from with across the public service, and they are in fact meeting. I believe they were scheduled to meet this month. And in order to start to roll this out in a more concerted fashion. Every department has been asked to come up with their own individualized approach with some specific actions, and again, I'd be more than happy to see, to provide each of those to the member. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Member from Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another part of the survey that came out, what is the GNWT doing about the widespread concern that information does not flow effectively between senior leadership and staff? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member from Yellowknife North, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a particular one that I read several of the individual EESSs for individual departments as well as for the GNWT as a whole. And there's often an interesting correlation between when information is not flowing and then what that can do to the overall morale in an individual place. So this is one of some particular interest to me. And again, on this one, Mr. Speaker, this is where each department, because there are often different processes and different types of hierarchies within them, are expected to have those individualized plans. Again, I have certainly seen some of them, but as for the individual implementation of each, I don't have that in front of me. I'm more than happy to get it and to put it forward, and frankly, this might be something that, given the magnitude and size, warrants a full briefing, but also I'll put it to the House here so that it can be tabled. Mr. Speaker, it's important that employees see that there's action being taken on this. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Oral questions, member from Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so building on that, many staff reported in the survey that they feel they don't have appropriate access to data and information in order to do their jobs effectively. So what is this government doing to ensure that confidentiality and secrecy is not our default mode, our default operating mode, to maximize the extent that the work that our staff are doing is actually being shared and made public? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member from Yellowknife North, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's quite a range of items under this. So as I mentioned, the sort of action committee that's formed from across departments, one of the very first tasks that they in fact have is this particular action item. It's to ensure that there are mechanisms and effective mechanisms so that employees can provide feedback and suggestions and in a way that they feel safe. Mr. Speaker, we do still have, of course, an MOU that exists for safe disclosure that is frankly underutilized, and so happy to have this opportunity to remind folks that that is there for staff to use should they feel it appropriate or necessary or uncertain, then they can certainly look at that. Mr. Speaker, there's also efforts across government of just doing a better job of communicating some of the work that departments are doing and that our staff are doing, not the least of which would be an example of yesterday or in a sessional statement of today. And of course, Open NWT continues to work towards having more information made available about what's happening within government. So again, quite a number of items, Mr. Speaker. If there's more to add at this point, I suspect a follow-up is likely to be tabled on this particular answer, and we'll add to it in this regard as well. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Final supplementary, member from Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So finally, there was a large decrease in satisfaction, particularly amongst employees of our divisional educational councils. And I've certainly heard myself from the NWT Teachers Association about growing struggles to attract and retain teachers. So how is finance working with ECE to address these concerns from educational council employees? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member from Yellowknife North. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there's obviously there's staff across the departments that are involved in this work, but quite specifically, there actually are individuals from the education councils who are involved, as I said, on this committee that's supposed to start moving some of these actions forward and is supposed to be monitoring the success of them. The education councils are somewhat separate, certainly, from what may be happening in ECE, and so it was important to have them included and involved. The problems and challenges they may have could be quite different and different likely across regions. So that first action item that they're tasked with, again, the mechanisms for feedback, suggestions about how to understand what might be coming from a headquarters vision, that is likely to be one that, well, at least we expect is having a significant impact on education council. So again, they are represented on the next steps of what we're doing, and that will be a big part of what's happening as the first step. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Oral questions. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are pretty clear that they're fed up with the consumer carbon tax in this country. No matter who the next Prime Minister is going to be, there isn't going to be a consumer carbon tax. So my question to the Minister responsible for the Minister of Finance is she ready to ditch the consumer carbon tax in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Member from Range Lake. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it's, I may have my own personal views as well, but let's keep it to the processes here. And Mr. Speaker, if or when this tax gets cancelled on a federal level, this Assembly can certainly expect to be revisiting that issue as well. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Member from Range Lake.
Mr. Speaker, we're often accused of being slow to move as a government. We have a bill that can be brought forward and acts the tax tomorrow. So is the Minister willing to support that legislation, Bill 3, and get rid of the carbon tax in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Here. Member from Range Lake. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, until there's a change in the federal legislation, we are still obligated to comply with some form of carbon taxation. And so, again, pending what may or may not be happening on a federal level or when, then we will certainly want to make sure that we're ready, and it's very helpful and handy to have something at the ready when that day comes. Thank you.
Finance. Member from Range Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I find it unlikely that a prorogue parliament and a government paralyzed by a leadership contest is going to be ready to impose the backstop. But let's give Northerners a carbon tax holiday until the feds can sort their business out. Can the minister commit to giving Northerners a carbon tax holiday until the federal election? Thank you.
Member from Range Lake. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, this particular bill actually might be with committee, and so not really for me to comment further on here. And as far as trying to circumvent whether or not we're supposed to comply with the federal law, again, Mr. Speaker, the only response I really can give is that we are supposed to comply with the federal law. But again, bill is before committee, and so certainly happy to see how that process may unfold. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Final supplementary. Member from Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the committee were to be supported, well, that's a hypothetical. Mr. Speaker, can the minister can also zero out the regs. She doesn't need legislation. She could make the regs $0 for the tax, $0 for the revenue. Is the minister willing to do that? Again, we have a golden opportunity to give Northerners a break for a couple of months. The minister, lower our cost of living, give Northerners a break, give them a carbon tax holiday. Thank you.
You're here.
Member from Range Lake. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have on many an occasion provided this House, both this government and the last, with my own frustrations with this carbon tax and the bit of stink I've raised with the federal ministers responsible for putting us in the situation we are in. Mr. Speaker, certainly, again, I'm happy to go and look at it, and if there's a way that I can appropriately and responsibly get ourselves out from underneath this tax, that's fine. It's not really a time where I necessarily want to try to stick it to the federal government or make something difficult or suggest that we're not on side with a federal piece of legislation. So, again, Mr. Speaker, this is not a tax that is well implemented in the North. We've all said that here. We just want to make sure that we are on side with the rules and regulations from the federal government. And that we are doing so in a way that is, particularly at this juncture with what's happening internationally, that we're doing so in a way that's respectful and responsible as a member of Team Canada. Thank you.
Minister of Finance. Oral questions. A member from Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because I like asking questions to the Minister of Housing, I think I'm going to ask another one. It's been taking a long time, glacial pace, to get the Aspen building project up and running. My understanding is the doors were just kicked open the other day and the contractors finally started work on that. Can the minister start off our discussion today with what's actually happening and when's that project anticipated to be completed? Thank you.
Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Housing and NWT.
Well, good news, the contract has been awarded, as the member knows, and we're hoping to have completion fall of 2025. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Housing and NWT. Member from Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we all know housing opportunities don't runneth over. So, in other words, there's not an oversupply in housing opportunities, certainly here in the capital or even in the regions and small communities. Mr. Speaker, what was the delay specifically as to get this initiative off the ground and into the construction phase? Because the last major report we had on this was through the Premier's office, where they were trying to evict the squatting tenants, as they say, so they could start construction. So can we find out what the delay was? Thank you.
Member from Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Housing and NWT.
Mr. Speaker, with Housing and NWT in our contracting process, we have to run through a number of processes and making sure that we're following policies with Housing and NWT, including the delay with the encampment, securing the site, and ensuring the employees on site are safe and secure. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for Housing and NWT. Final supplementary. Member from Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to hear the minister is now converting to the minister of process, because it seems to come out in almost every answer that the process will be led by the process once we're convened on the process. Mr. Speaker, can the minister be more specific, because the encampment was removed in large part out of the way months ago. Furthermore, I think the lone holdout still wouldn't have caused an issue. That said, there must have been a real reason that contract had not started. And I'm asking, what's the delay? Because ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I want to know who's responsible for the delay. Was it the contractor? Was it the GNWT? And will we be taking responsibility? I think the Premier's waving at you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Member from Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Housing and NWT.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm a little distracted here as well, but yeah, there's processes. If I'm the Minister of Processes, that's fine, but again, we have to follow process. We are government, we're a public government, so again, Aspen Apartments, it's gone through a number of things. We have awarded a contract, the work is ongoing, the site is secure, there was an encampment issue. There's a number of things that happened, so thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister responsible for Housing and NWT. Colleagues, our time is up for oral questions. Oral questions. Oral questions, written questions. Mr. Clerk. Well, returns to written questions. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question number 8-20(1), asked by the member for Great Slave on October 30th, 2024, regarding improving fertility and family planning supports in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 9-20 bracket 1 asked by the member for Yellowknife Centre on October 31st, 2024 regarding the staffing of doctor and specialist positions within the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question number 10-20 bracket 1 asked by the member for Tunaday-Willowday on November 1st, 2024 regarding complaints in the healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question number 11-20 bracket 1 asked by the member for Range Lake on November 1st, 2024 regarding ground search and rescue. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question number 12-20 bracket 1 asked by the member for Yellowknife Centre on November 1st, 2024 regarding the cost of living. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioner's address. Replies to the Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports on committees of the review of bills. Reports of committees of the review of bills. Reports on standing and special committees. Reports on standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Housing NWT.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 4 documents. Follow-up letter for oral question 303-20 brackets 1, local housing organization support. Follow-up letter for oral question 306-20 brackets 1, housing repairs. Follow-up letter for oral question 378-20 bracket 1, housing waitlist, and follow-up letter for oral question 405-20 bracket 1, winter road season planning. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Housing NWT. Tabling of documents. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 10 documents. Follow-up letter for oral question 305-20 bracket 1, heating oil. Follow-up letter for oral question 323-20 bracket 1, Dempster Highway and Inuvik Tuktoyaktuk Highway conditions. Follow-up letter for oral question 325-20 bracket 1, project cost overruns. Follow-up letter for oral question 343-20 bracket 1, impacts of climate change on winter and ice roads. Follow-up letter for oral question 374-20 bracket 1, Mackenzie Valley Fiber Line Backup. Follow-up letter for oral question 421-20 bracket 1, regulations for e-scooters. Follow-up letter for oral question 333-20 bracket 1, fiscal policy. Follow-up letter for oral question 333-20 bracket 1, housing budget allocations. Follow-up letter for oral question 418-20 bracket 1, cell service. And follow-up letter for oral question 423-20 bracket 1, carbon tax. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister responsible for infrastructure. Tabling of documents. Mr. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 6 documents. Additional information for written question 11-20 brackets 1, ground search and rescue. Additional information for written question 12-20 brackets 1, cost of living. Follow-up letter for oral question 312-20 brackets 1, transitional housing options and supports. Follow-up letter for oral question 361-20 brackets 1, healthcare sustainability initiative. Follow-up letter for oral question 413-20 brackets 1, economic viability of the Northwest Territories. And follow-up letter for oral question 397-20 brackets 1, overdose-related RCMP calls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Premier, tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 14 documents. Additional information for written question 9-20 brackets 1, physician vacancy rates. Follow-up letter for oral question 328-20 brackets 1, speech language pathologist positions. Follow-up letter for oral questions 340-20 brackets 1, supported living review and recommendations. Follow-up letter for oral questions 342-20 brackets 1, primary care reform. Follow-up letter for oral questions 347-20 brackets 1, physician workforce plan. Follow-up letter for oral questions 348 brackets 1, healthcare services. Follow-up letter for oral questions 358-20, brackets 1, primary care physicians. Follow-up letter, oral questions 364-20, brackets 1, Toledo Health Center project. Follow-up letter for oral question 369-20, brackets 1, denomination healthcare concerns. Follow-up letter for oral questions 375-20, brackets 1, updates to diagnostic imaging medical communication system. Follow-up letter for oral questions 376-20, brackets 1, online physician booking service. Follow-up letter for oral questions 382-20, brackets 1, approval of non-medical escorts. Follow-up letter for oral questions 399-20, brackets 1, diagnostic rates for autism. And follow-up letter for oral questions 419-20, brackets 1, Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority operational concerns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services. Table any documents. Member from the Sawtooth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table a package of documents dated, compiled by the town of Norman Wells regarding the town's declaration of a local state of emergency for humanitarian reasons. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member from the Sawtooth. Tabling the documents. Colleagues, pursuant to Section 106.4 of the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act, I wish to table a report of the Northwest Territories Integrity Commissioner on the complaint by Daniel Richards, Denizli Nakako, about staffing appeals from hiring decisions by the Northwest Territories Power Corporation. As well, pursuant to Section 106(4) of the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act, I wish to table the report on the Northwest Territories Integrity Commissioner dismissing the complaint by Denizli Nakako about Minister Wozniak's husband owning shares in the Canadian Utilities Limited. Tabling the documents. Tabling the documents. Notice of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notice of motions for first reading of bills. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Friday, February 7, 2025, I will present Bill 17, Municipal and Community Affairs Statutes Amendments Act, to be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. Notice of motion for first reading of bills. Just have a quick break. First reading of bills, Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I give notice that on Friday, February 7th, 2025, I will present Bill 18, an act to amend the Partnership and Business Names Act, to be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
To Minister of Justice. Notice of motions for first reading of bills. Notice of motions first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Committee report 17-20, brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedures and Privilege report on review of rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, with the member from the Sawtooth in the chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wishes of committee? The member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, Mr. Chair, the committee would like to consider, right here, sorry, committee report, apologies. Committee would like to consider Committee Report 17-20 brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges Report on Review of the Rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you, committee. We will take a short recess and resume with the first item. Booth on. Thank you. Welcome back, members. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters, Committee Report 17-20 brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges Report on the Rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. Committee, we have agreed to consider Committee Report 17-20 brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges Report on the Rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. I will go to the Chair of the Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges for any opening comments. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In May and July of 2024, the committee received correspondence from Speaker Thompson requesting a review of many of the rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. The committee has considered the matters referred by the Speaker and delivered its report to the House on October 29th, 2024. Individual members may have additional comments on the motions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the member, Great Slave. I will now open the floor to general comments on Committee Report 17-20 brackets 1. Okay, seeing no further comments, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Chapter 4 be amended by adding the words "or reflection" after each instance of the word prayer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The motion is order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? All those abstaining? The motion is carried. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 5.4 brackets 2 be amended by adding the words "or reflection" after the word prayer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the member for Great Slave. Question? Question has been called. All those in favor? Yay. All those opposed? All those abstaining? The motion is carried. To the member Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 5.8 brackets 2 be amended by deleting the words "1 hour" and inserting the words "24 hours." Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The member Great Slave. Motion is in order. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? All those abstaining? The motion is carried. Back to the member Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that the clerk be granted authority to produce consolidations of the rules to correct spelling, grammatical, and punctuation errors alongside non-controversial changes within the rules, without requiring those changes to be made by way of motion in the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Motion's in order. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? All those abstaining? The motion is carried. Back to the member of Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 5.2 brackets 2 be amended by inserting the words "or the final sitting day prior to the dissolution of a legislative assembly" after the word "prorogation." Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member Great Slave. Motion is in order. All in favor? All opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. Back to the member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that the following rule be added to Chapter 4. 4.1, brackets 5. The daily orders of business in the Assembly on Thursdays shall be 1. Prayer. 2. Minister statements. 3. Member statements. 4. Motions. 5. Returns to oral questions. 6. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. 7. Acknowledgements. 8. Oral questions. 9. Written questions. 10. Returns to written questions. 11. Replies to the Commissioner's address. 12. Petitions. 13. Reports of committees on the review of bills. 14. Reports of standing and special committees. 15. Tabling of documents. 16. Notices of motion. 17. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. 18. First reading of bills. 19. Second reading of bills. 20. Consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. 21. Report of committee of the whole. 22. Third reading of bills. 23. Orders of the day. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the member, Great Slave. Motion is in order. Questions have been called. All in favor? All opposed? Any abstentions? Back to the member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 7.2, brackets 2, brackets B, be amended by adding the words within 21 calendar days or on the first day of the next sitting if 21 calendar days lapse between sittings, after the words return to oral questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member from Great Slave. Motion's in order. Question's been called. All in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Back to the member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 7.2, brackets 4, be amended by replacing the words 3 with 2. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member, Great Slave. Motion is in order. Questions have been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Back to the member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 7.2, bracket 6 be amended by deleting the words table that information in the Assembly and replacing them with the words file that information with the clerk. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member, Great Slave. Motion's in order. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 7.2, bracket 7 be added. Under the term oral questions, the clerk shall inform the Assembly of the follow-ups to oral questions received, deliver copies to the members who ask the questions, and have the returns printed and answered. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member, Great Slave. Motion's in order. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 2.2, brackets 1 be deleted and be replaced with the following. 2.2, brackets 1. Unless otherwise ordered, the sitting hours of the Assembly shall be as follows. A. Mondays and Wednesdays from 1:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. B. Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. C. Fridays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member, Great Slave. Motion is in order. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 2.2, brackets 2 be amended by replacing the words at 6 p.m. on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and at 2 p.m. on Fridays, with at the designated adjournment time of a sitting day. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member, Great Slave. Motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Member, Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends the following rule be added to Chapter 9. 9.1 brackets 15. When Committee of the Whole is considering a minister's statement, questions relating to the content of the statement shall only be directed to the minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The motion is in order. To the motion. Minister Simler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this committee recommendation. I've reflected on my experience both as a regular member and as the past chair of Committee of the Whole in the 19th Assembly. I've also considered where discussions like this usually take place in the Legislative Assembly and where there are several areas where this happens. Mr. Chair, question period. Members have the opportunity to ask any question they like during question period. Members may use this time during question period to question ministers about the statements they have made, as this happens in an appropriate setting for those discussions. Recently, there has been a change to question period, reducing, well, we just talked about it, reducing the number of questions. Adjusting this will allow for a broader range of topics and questions to be added during question period. With this change, members will have more opportunities to ask questions, including those related to minister statements. Minister statements, it's important to note that minister statements are often related to information that's already public or information that members have already received. This may include data that is readily accessible online, and in many cases, members can find this information themselves without needing to discuss it during Committee of the Whole time. Standing Committee. Technical briefings. Standing Committee are allowed to request technical briefings at any time. These briefings offer a more in-depth opportunity to ask detailed questions about a topic and get detailed responses from technical experts. Standing committees may also request ministerial briefings in which they can discuss the political implications of discussion or a decision or a program, service, or policy issue. These briefings can be public, ensuring members have the chance to engage thoroughly and gain deeper insight into the issue, and ensuring NWT residents have the opportunity to tune in on a particular issue of interest to them. Efficiency of Committee of the Whole time. Committee of the Whole time is limited and valuable time resource. It is essential that we use this time efficiently. If we make this rule change, we might end up spending excessive time discussing government programs, services, policies, issues that could be better suited for other forms and settings. Logistical challenges for department officials. If ministers are required technical support from department officials under these new rules, we may face logistical challenges. Requests for officials to appear may be made at the last minute. Department officials are busy and already have prior commitments. Asking them to rearrange their schedules at short notice is unfair to staff and can disrupt their work. Requests for guidelines and unanimous consent. If this rule change is approved, I propose that we work with rules and procedures, the new name of the committee, that's the last 19th Assembly Committee name, to put clear guidelines in place. These guidelines would set a parameter of how these discussions can occur during Committee of the Whole, ensuring that we respect the time of members, ministers, and staff. I would also request that an unanimous consent be considered by this committee as a requirement that we are to refer a minister statement into Committee of the Whole. This would ensure that all members are on board and that the process is handled fairly. I also believe that, if we were to do this, could be an opportunity, but it would be something that we would be prepared to be able to, further have technical information on if we were going to bring it into Committee of the Whole. So those are just my questions and my to put those forwards. I will be not in favor of this this change. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Similar to the motion. Minister McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be voting no against these two recommendations, so I thought it was important that I say a few words, as I am a member of this committee, and I felt it was only fair for me to explain myself. As a member and a new member to the Legislative Assembly, we go sometimes into these meetings and there's a lot of information, a lot of dialogue going on with all this stuff, and sometimes you don't realize the outcome of these recommendations until you've talked to experienced members, past members, and realizing the outcome of a recommendation like this. I believe that members' times, employees' times are very important, and some of this work when questioning a minister's statement, having staff sitting around waiting for the resources to back up a minister for witnesses and the information that goes with it, having them in the sidelines waiting for that questioning or that when the minister's statement's brought to committee, I don't think is well use of the time. So I do respect the process and I do understand this, but as a new member, as a new elected MLA, and understanding what the outcome would be now, I have a difference of opinion on the recommendation. So that's my explanation, and I just thought it would be fair to explain that to the members as a new member for voting against these two recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister McKay. To the member, Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while I appreciate that we are, have differences of opinion on anything, and right now on this particular proposal to change the rules, the Standing Committee on Procedures and Privilege. Sorry, other way around. I know. Many privileges, one procedure, but carefully considered this referral, and the impetus behind it is there's a rule currently, it is 5.3 brackets 3, and it is under minister statements, and it's any member may, without notice, move a minister statement into committee of the whole for discussion immediately following the conclusion of minister statements on the day the statement was delivered in the assembly. So what that means in plain language is if a minister makes a statement of, well, whatever they happen to do, but let's say it's a statement of policy, that members may immediately move that statement into committee of the whole, which is what we're doing right now, to discuss it at length. Now, the problem with this is there's no requirement for the minister or witnesses to engage with this. And in practice, what has happened is the statement will come down to committee of the whole. Members want to have, a robust discussion around its contents, and it would be one side of the house talking to itself, essentially. And the intention of this rule is to allow scrutiny around statements of public policy that are coming forward. It's an ancient rule, and there's, as the minister pointed out, my honorable colleagues across the way, as they pointed out, there are other ways we get at that now through standing committee hearings and things like that. That being said, the idea that this will be a kind of de facto thing, that as soon as a member says, hey, I want the minister's statement moved into committee of the whole, that it automatically comes here, that witnesses have to be called, that it grinds government to a halt and wastes all the staff time. I think those are overblown because, quite frankly, if members started to abuse this rule, there's a vote. This thing's not automatic. So, if cabinet feels or any members of the House feels that this rule's being abused and it's a waste of or an unnecessary use of House time and resources, then vote against it. That's the safeguard. So we're not changing the rules in such a way that they can be abused because there's always a check on them. And, quite frankly, in committee of the whole, I could move a motion right now and call a witness to come in and sit here from the public service. If it carries, right? But we'd still have to vote on it. And cabinet could rightfully say, well, you didn't give us any time or heads up, so we're not going to, we don't think that's a good idea, and we're going to vote it down. So the problem we're trying to fix is this is kind of a vestigial, this is an appendix. It's a vestigial part of the rules that doesn't have any practical application. So the committee's effort was to give it practical application in a way that would allow for robust debate around areas of public policy. And in this consensus government, the whole point is we talk a lot, and we talk a lot about the issues that are important to our constituents. We have more time as members in this institution than any other parliamentarian in Canada. Maybe Nunavut is close to ours. But let's say for southern Canada, certainly we have more time than those assemblies and parliaments. So that's the point here, is we're here to talk about the issues. We're here to debate the issues. We're not here to just do government business. There's two sides of this house, and at the end of the day, it's the people we serve, and our constituents want to see us have these debates. They want to see us raise issues on their behalf. They don't want us to just call votes line by line on estimates documents. That's something we're going to do anyway. So I don't understand the concern, because again, there's a safeguard built in here, which is the up or down vote. And if this is ever used as a procedural tactic to filibuster or delay progress in this assembly, there's a safeguard already built into it. So the effort here is to take, again, a vestigial rule that doesn't have much purpose and give it some new life and allow for more robust and engaging debate around public policy issues. And just because we hear it at standing committee, most of that works in camera. We can have public hearings and people may tune in, but they also, when we're sitting, the public's attention is on us. The media's attention's on us as well. And sometimes there is a statement of public policy that people want to talk about. And I think that we should leave that option available to the members to decide how to use it, rather than keeping it on the books as it is. And I might add, even if we don't make this rule change today, there's nothing stopping members from doing this. And if we need to work, if members have the desire for witnesses to be brought in, we can make those motions as well. I just think this would be a better way to do it, where it follows fidelity with our process for reviewing estimates and bills, rather than having it right now where we have ministers who make these statements say basically, you guys can talk about it, I'm just going to sit back, maybe I'll chime in. That's not the intention here. So I really think that we're raising alarms over nothing, because again, if there's not a desire to use the rule, then it can be voted down. But the way it stands right now, we should get rid of it or make it useful. And the committee's goal, the committee decided to try to make it more useful. And I do support that direction. I know that my honorable friend across the way from Hay River South was on that committee as well, and he's heard these submissions as well. So I appreciate what he's saying today, but I do fundamentally disagree. I think we should always err on the side of more debate in this chamber, not less, and we should not be giving way to the voices of our constituents for the business of, or for the machinery of government. The people should come first, not the process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the member Range Lake. To the motion, recognizing the member from Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess fundamentally the MLA for Range Lake has spoken quite well with respect to the issue. I mean, often we worry about convenience in the sense of, well, we could just move it along without proper to's and fro's of good, valuable discussion. And I think really the public's being denied this opportunity by this simple change. As you mentioned, we could do it through other forces by forcing it through an actual vote, or we can make it part of the normal business, given the fact that even if we don't do it, it's still there. I honestly see that currently now it's set up as a one-sided dialogue, and I think the public is truly being ultimately denied that dynamic conversation that's important. I won't go at length, or you won't repeat what he said about the nature of our politics, but just having this discussion, even for the consideration of it, is very important. We always have other opportunities, and if Cabinet still feels it's being threatened in the sense of time or et cetera, in the process-wise, they could always write the Speaker and just say, we feel the spirit and the intent of what this has been, has never lived up to why the members asked for it or why committee supported this, and we could clearly change it back. Because the whole idea, from my view, is making these dynamic conversations. I mean, it's frustrating hearing that people only say something once, and then they don't hear an answer later, and then they don't know why. People get mad at us saying, well, why didn't they answer that question? Well, they already spoke. Oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. The last thing, and this one's going to be a little bit, what's the word, prickly. I think that statement about wasting resources was about the most rich insult this side of the House has heard. And it's not directed at the member, because we heard the other person say it yesterday. I mean, yesterday alone, in the gallery, in the Great Hall, we had the Premier flanked by 6 ministers or 5 ministers, and frankly, the frustration is money's being spent in different types of processes, and we have no way of, you're saying this is a waste of money having a witness available? The fact that tomorrow when the budget speech is, we're going to see loads of deputy ministers, hundreds of thousands of dollars of brain trust sitting there just listening to the finance minister's speech. And all we're asking for is better witness engagement for a conversation. So I don't think the fairness of the dialogue is that we're intending to waste money. No one's criticizing you're wasting money. We're just trying to make these dynamic, fruitful conversations that we can share improperly so the public can see the value of them. And I'm sorry that may be sensitive, but having deputy ministers sit in the gallery for an hour, stand around for an hour, and all we're asking for is potentially 1 or 2 witnesses, even if we call upon them, is a bargain considering the value of the money that's being spent. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think that that's a fair statement by saying it's a waste of resources in any way. I mean, at that point, we might as well just only do minister statements, and even those, I don't even know if we need to do them a year. We could shut down the whole process probably, if it was all about the money. But it's not. It should be about the dialogue and narrative of how we get there. So, Mr. Chairman, that's I think it's a missed opportunity for those who want this to be shut out. And it's those who decide that they don't like the process, which can extend question period, don't like this, don't like it. This is us trying to engage people in the process. So there you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the member, Yellowknife Centre. I want to remind to the motion that was mentioned, members please stay focused on the motion at hand. Moving on to the motion, the member from Frame Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly don't have a nearly as passionate opinion on this one as my previous colleagues, but would just say that, as a member of the committee, committee had a discussion about this, made the recommendation that we did, and, I was in favor of it there, and so I'll support it here, and would just note that I think my experience of referrals of of member statements to committee of the whole so far is that a bunch of them have been referred. We've yet to actually debate one. It does seem like something that is not a big issue right now, and certainly as a member of the committee would be happy to see a referral of this back if need be, because the rule is being abused in some way or it's not providing the opportunity for the fulsome debate that my colleagues are speaking about. Certainly this is something that can easily be referred back to the committee. It's definitely not the busiest committee in the Assembly, and we have the time to review such things. So I'd be happy to review it again. But I would just say, committee made the recommendation. I'm in favor of following committee's recommendation. I don't think that this one is going to cause as much trouble as some of the ministers feel it might. If there's any indication to me that that's starting to become the case, I'll happily be a part of reviewing it again and taking a second look at it. But as a member pointed out, the member for Range Lake, I mean, the rule exists already that minister statements can be referred to committee of the whole, so this is just putting some parameters around that, and the debate itself that might ensue could potentially be more useful to the Assembly. I think it stands to be seen whether or not it's going to be used very much at all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member Frame Lake. To the motion, recognizing Inuvik Bootleg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was a member of this committee as well. I will be supporting the motion. Again, I'm not going to reiterate what all my colleagues have already said. I'm shocked that we're spending this much time on it, given the the other fish that we have to fry in this building. It's again, the opportunity to do it has already been there. As my colleagues have said, I support the motion, and I'm hoping that we can move forward and have a vote. And again, as a member from Frame Lake said, if it gets deferred back, we'll take it back to committee.
Thank you to the member Inuvik Bootleg. To the motion, recognizing The member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make clear that Cabinet doesn't have a position on this. All the Cabinet ministers may vote the same way, but there is no Cabinet position. This is these are motions about how this House functions, and members are allowed to vote as they please. We all have different experiences, and it's all very procedural. My issue with this motion is that, like one of the previous speakers, I've been a regular member, I've been a chair of Committee of the Whole, I've been a minister, and so I have some perspective on things. And my concern about resourcing, it's not so much external resources, it's our resources here, it's our time. We often spend late nights in this House, and often we're up against the wall, rushing through very important things that we actually should be discussing, that can only be discussed here in this House. Things like the budget, things like bills when we're at second and third reading. And what this is proposing here, and we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it's never used, but we are talking about potentially adding more into Committee of the Whole when Committee of the Whole is time that can only be used for certain things. We have a number of standing committees. I think I see 5 chairs in front of me right now with 5 different standing committees. And so there's plenty of opportunities to have these discussions in public. Ministers are happy to get in front of standing committee. There's always offers to get in front of standing committee. Always happy to have public briefings on different topics. And there's no concern about us Cabinet having to answer questions in the House related to statements. That's what we do in the House. That's pretty much the whole job of being a minister in the House, is answering questions, whether it's about bills, budgets, or during question period. So I actually agree with the member for Range Lake. Let's get rid of the rule. We're trying to do something with it. Well, we can get rid of it. I think that's probably more utility than attacking this additional rule on here and basically taking something that can be done in standing committee and transplanting it back into this House. So I think that's about all the notes I have here, and I will agree with the, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Hay River North. To the motion? Question's been called. I'm going to back up here, committee, and allow the member from Yellowknife South. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I appreciate the work of committee. I was relatively agnostic towards most of the recommendations and quite happy to just accept them and again, I'm not on the committee. It's a lot of work to go through these things. I'm glad they've done it. I appreciate the recommendations. This one obviously has come up now and there's been a lot of discussion. I have had a lot of opportunity over the last 5 years to sit in the witness chair during committees of the whole, between different departments, particularly with finance. It is actually a great opportunity for me to talk all about government because I get asked quite a range of conversations and quite a range of topics. I don't necessarily mind that, Mr. Chair. And so with respect to the idea that the rule as it exists would be one-sided, Mr. Chair, I'd probably find it pretty hard to sit on my hands if I had a room of members making comments about a statement I had made. So happy to try to see if the rule could work as it is. But outside of that, I have to say I am swayed that this is not about deputy ministers' time. This is literally their job to come and do this stuff, and it's sometimes their job to come to this House and be in this House. I'm not worried about that. I am sometimes though worried that we do wind up, and I've seen it happen repeatedly, that right at the end of session we are rushing through things because it's taken so long to get through the items that are in COW. Not that the things that we're talking about aren't important, but just that there's other places that we could have those conversations, not the least of which is question period, but also all the committee work that can happen throughout the entire year. And wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if the public had opportunities throughout the year through those processes to have a bit of meat on what is happening in this Assembly and in the government. And so I think I am swayed by that, and we'll be voting accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the member. To the question or to the motion? Question's been called. All in favor? All opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried. 7 in favor, 6 opposed. Member Great-Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that the following rule be added to Chapter 9, 9.1, brackets 16. When Committee of the Whole is considering a minister's statement, the minister may have witnesses appear to supply information as required. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Great-Slave. The motion is in order. To the motion. Questions? Before I move on, the member for Hay River, I keep getting confused. North, please go ahead.
You can be forgiven, Mr. Speaker. We've only worked together 5 years. Come on. Or Mr. Chair, I apologize. I'm just joking, of course. That's what happens. I get a little cheeky and I get my comeuppance. So, I just have a question, actually, and I know that it's not question period. We can't refer to questions here, but as required are the last 2 words here, and I was wondering what that means. Supply information as required. Is it referring to the minister? The witnesses may be there as required, or the information may be supplied as required? I'd just like some clarity on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I will take that comment and provide an answer similar to the other processes we have with the committee of whole, where ministers could bring in witnesses, and witnesses are able to appear and supply information as required. Okay, I shall go back to the motion. Yep. Okay, Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for using your discretion, giving me another chance. I guess it seems redundant, and so I was wondering if there was something that I was missing, but maybe the chair wants to address that in closing comments on this item, but thank you.
Thank you, Member Hay River North. Member Great-Slave to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I certainly am happy to try and clarify, but I believe, Mr. Chair, what you said is accurate. It's simply to say that if witnesses appear, they can supply information at the witnesses table. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the Member Great-Slave to the motion. Question's been called. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion has been carried. Back to the Member Great-Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this committee recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories bring forward legislation that includes provisions for bills to have both a technical title and a short title. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Great-Slave. Motion's in order. To the motion. The Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Cabinet does have a position on this one because this is a recommendation for government. And so when there's a recommendation for government, we do abstain. We want to ensure that we can actually look into these issues before we put a vote to it. So we'll be abstaining. Thank you.
Thank you to the Member Hay River North. To the member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, respectfully to premiers, I hear what he's saying clearly about a recommendation of the government, but I would also semi-disagree in saying this is the rule of the Assembly that all bills come with a name. So it's more of Assembly process, even though, yes, you are the stewards of the normal bills and normal process, and if we pass, well, at the rate this Assembly is going, what, half a dozen bills in 4 years, I don't know, or less. The principle being is, it's true, 99% will come from the government, but I don't view this as a government direction. I see this as an administrative direction to the Assembly that all bills come forward in that manner. So I'm only disagreeing in the sense that I think it's a broader view. You know, I don't hesitate to disagree if I feel necessary or don't feel necessary, one or the other. But the truth be told is I don't view it that way. I see strictly as a procedure matter. So I would encourage a free vote from Cabinet, unshackle the bonds of that's all.
To the member, Yellowknife Centre. To the motion. Question's been called. All in favour? All opposed? All abstained? Okay. Okay, motion's been carried. Member Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for your patience. This is the last one. I move that this committee recommends that Rule 4.3, brackets 1, be amended by replacing the words member or the clerk with person. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Member Great Slave. To the motion, or the motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All in favour? All opposed? Any abstentions? Motion's carried. Thank you, committee. Do you agree that you have concluded consideration of committee report 17-20, brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges report on the review the rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly? Thank you, committee. We have concluded consideration of the committee report 17-20, brackets 1, Standing Committee on Procedure and Privileges report on the review the rules of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly. What is the will of the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Order, a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. Massey. Okay. We're done. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, committee is concluded?
Yeah. So just go.
Motion's carried and committee is concluded. Yep. I will now rise and report progress. Massey.
Good. Okay. Reports of committee reports on Committee of the Whole. Member from the Sawtooth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee has been considering Committee Report 17-20, brackets 1, and would like to report progress with 16 motions carried. That Committee Report 17-20, brackets 1, are concluded. Mussey.
Thank you. To the motion, can I have a seconder? Moved by Deitcho. Second by the Deitcho. All those in favor? All those in... You said nay. Let's try this again, boys and girls. All those in favor? Thank you. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Orders of the day for Thursday, February 6, 2025, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, budget address, minister statements, member statements, motions, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, replies to the budget address, day 1 of 7. Acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's address. Petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Tuesday, February 6, 2025 at 1:30 p.m.